All right, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a good weekend. I hope you had a safe weekend. I think hopefully it was good after the almost overwhelmingly good grades on the exam. I was very pleased to see such high scores. A couple students did email me about one or two questions, and I'm going to review those later today or tomorrow and make any adjustments that I would need to make. But like I said, overall, the exam grades were pretty good. And it gives you kind of an idea of what future exams will look like. They'll basically be the same format. Other thing, I will also be posting a Word document in the modules that will explain the final paper, the research paper, and basically the rough draft. So you'll be writing a rough draft, and the TAs will grade it and give it back to you, and then basically you will make the necessary changes or suggested changes and turn it back in. If you do a really good job of writing your first paper, you don't necessarily have to revise it, but that will be up to me and the TAs. So, like I said, that will be in the modules later. I will also show a video, I should say make a video, kind of going over the details of it. And I will also show or post a video on how to find peer-reviewed sources in the library. One of the most important things about this paper is the use of peer-reviewed sources. What are those? Sources reviewed by your friends or something? It's called peer review in science to refer to specialists in the field. So when I was a managing editor of a journal, we would get these studies, these manuscripts from researchers all around the world. Maybe there would be one on marine ecosystems in China. And so we would contact other researchers, experts on that topic, and see if they wanted to review it. And then if it passed the review, then it could be published. So peer review basically means that the research has been reviewed by other researchers. Sometimes it's tested again, that sort of thing. With COVID, it's been kind of interesting because a lot of the research, we've just needed so quickly that it hasn't gone through peer review, that we're having to make policies based on studies before they've gone through the peer review process. So anyway, like I said, there will be a video explaining that, and that's very important because you need 4 of those sources for the paper, and if you're missing one, that's 20 points off. So, if it's the Wall Street Journal, that'll be 20 points off because that's not an academic, scientific, peer-reviewed journal. Again, I'll make a video that kind of goes over some of this in more detail. So today, this week, we're talking about population, the environment, and urbanization. 3 pretty big topics that we kind of lump into one. So I'm mainly going to focus on population today, and then the environment and urbanization on Thursday. One interesting thing, though, is most of the data and the stuff in this presentation was compiled before COVID. So demographers aren't quite sure how that's going to impact population trends. We do know that the projected size of the U.S. population has been falling, and that's because people are having less children, more stringent, immigration laws, that sort of thing, and possibly COVID as well. COVID may play a role in terms of, keep preventing people from coupling, that sort of thing. People not wanting to raise kids or have kids during a pandemic, and so on. And, you'll be reading about this in the Christakis book, so we can spend much more time talking about this later. Now, this is a question that's, one of those trick questions. If starving children are fed in poor countries, the population growth rate will generally A, go down, or B, go up. Most people intuitively will think that the population growth rate would go up because you've got all these kids who would have died and now they're alive, and certainly that must mean that the population growth rate will go up. Actually, over time, it goes down, and not much time. So another way you can think about this, if we save children in overpopulated countries, won't that accelerate the population growth rate over time? A, yes. B, no. The answer is surprisingly no. And this is one of those, findings that, us social scientists love, because it's kind of, it's counterintuitive, and I'll kind of explain this, and we'll watch a little video on it a little bit later. But so there's been a lot of concern about the human population and its growth for quite some time, especially when the environmental movements really began in the 1960s. In the late 60s, you get books like this coming out, Famine, 1975. Paul Ehrlich, a fairly famous and renowned biologist at Stanford, wrote The Population Bomb. This was kind of a bestseller, basically saying that, we're going to outstrip our resources because we have such a large population. Interestingly, let me go back to Ehrlich here. Interestingly, he had a bet with an economist named Julian Simon, and this was in the early 1980s. And basically, they were betting on what was going to happen with the price of certain metals. Copper, tungsten, I can't remember, there were 5 of them in total. And I think they were, it was like they're going 5 to 10 years. And I think it was like $4,000 or something that the bet was for. And Julian Simon, the economist, he said that he thought the prices of those metals and stuff would go down. Ehrlich thought that, just growing population, meaning more demand, would lead prices to go up. After the 5 or 10 years had passed, Ehrlich had to give, $4,000 over to the economist Julian Simon. Julian Simon then writes this book called The Ultimate Resource, and the ultimate resource being our own ingenuity. So he thought that the price of those metals would go down because we would learn more efficient ways of using it. That we wouldn't keep using copper in the same way in 1975 that we would be using it in 1985. Things have changed. In California, for example, you've had a growth of the population, but you've actually had a decrease in water use per capita. Might not seem like that matters much with the big drought there right now, but it's the same thing with energy. Well, the population in California was rising in the 1970s. The per capita energy use was actually falling. So, kind of interesting things there, dynamics of population. Ehrlich was kind of famous for developing this sort of formula, IPAT, impact, meaning, the impact on the earth, environmental impact, is basically equal to the population and the level of affluence or consumption and technology. And so, the first two are fairly easy to measure. You can measure population, you can measure how wealthy people are, that sort of thing. Harder to tell about technology. In some ways, technology absolutely has done nothing but pollution, done nothing but pollute the environment. But then again, there are also a lot of technologies that have helped reduce pollution. So it's hard to kind of figure where technology lies in this formula, and that's one of the problems with it. The other big problem is that it's based on averages. And so the population effect is calculated as if it's proportionate, meaning that, people in the United States are treated the same as people in Madagascar in terms of their impact on the world. Well, we know that's not true. We know that, Americans use, we're 5% of the world's population, we use about 25% of the world's resources. So, people in Madagascar don't use nearly as much. So, population growth in some places is far, far less environmentally damaging than what we see in motorcycle out there, I think, than what we see in some of these rich countries. So that's one big problem, is that it fails to acknowledge that, there are some countries and some people within countries that use a lot more resources than others. And then I already talked about technology. So going back to kind of the start of the study of population, Thomas Malthus was an economist. He worked essentially for the British East India Company, which kind of essentially ran India for some time. And he's the first economist to try and figure out how population levels play a role in society. And so he had this idea that, nature has its own way to cut population levels, crime, disease, war, vice, these things being, he called it the necessary checks on population. That last sentence there, don't worry about it. I'll explain that in much more detail in 1 second. So sometimes you'll hear the phrase a Malthusian crisis. A Malthusian crisis, people are referring to essentially population growth, kind of exceeding food supply. And that's really what the worry was with population back in the 1800s, that you'd have too large a population than you could feed. A little bit different today. So in terms of kind of the modern Malthus, figure out where to put myself so I'm not too much in the way. Okay. A guy named Garrett Hardin, who is a former biologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I got my PhD. In 1968, he writes this famous article called The Tragedy of the Commons. By some measures, it's one of the most read articles in history. So Hardin was pretty controversial. He was in favor of expanded abortion. He favored immigration restrictions, believed in sort of the selfish gene theory, eugenics almost. He also believed that, governments may have to enact coercive measures to control overpopulation, as we saw in China, which, by the way, has not worked out that well. Anyway, we'll get there. He committed suicide together with his wife in Santa Barbara on their 62nd wedding anniversary. Interesting fact about him. That's not relevant, really, anyway. So, like I said, he's famous for this tragedy of the commons idea. And it's essentially a metaphor. So the idea here is that you have a pasture, a field. It's held in common for these cattle herders. And for the sake of simplicity, we'll just say that, everyone gets one cow that they can have on the field. But one of these people realizes that, if they just added another cow, they could have twice as much profit, twice as much meat, milk, whatever. So they do this. And then you start seeing other cattle herders say, hey, I could add more too and make more money. And everyone starts doing this, and pretty soon the land is overgrazed and degraded. And, you go from this, beautiful looking pasture that's relatively empty to, the fields covered with livestock. And so the tragedy of the commons then refers to basically resources in general. Hardin was arguing that people act through rational choices. Remember, we talked about rational choice theory, and he was a strong adherent of that. So remember, I talked about how rational choice theory was the dominant way of viewing things back in the 20th century. And so according to Hardin, it would be in someone's rational interest, their rational self-interest, to use as many resources as they could, in order to thrive, succeed, and so on. He later said he should have called it the tragedy of the unregulated commons. He said that, socialism or capitalism, either one could avoid the tragedy of the commons as long as there is a manager. And for him, the manager was usually the government or, a large corporation. In other words, some, large bureaucracy. So when we look at where a lot of the resource use is coming from, where a lot of the population, where the population is located, the vast majority living in Asia, it's a pretty small percentage that actually live in North America. But, like I said, we use about 25% of the world's resources, and that's just the U.S., not counting Canada or Mexico. In terms of population, China still has the world's largest population. India may surpass China in the coming years. We'll kind of see what happens. Again, this is all pre-COVID, so things are definitely going to have to be adjusted, and which will give the demographers at Penn State Sociology plenty to do in the years ahead. Now, Hardin was basically wrong in his assumption that you have to have, rational government or corporate managers. Elinor Ostrom did a lot of pioneering research where she found, looking at all sorts of different communities that were sharing resources. She also looked at everything from, Southern California and water systems, all sorts of tribal arrangements, looked at police departments. They did interviews, they did statistical analyses, they did experiments and game theory, and just a whole bunch of things. And in that way, Elinor Ostrom's kind of a personal hero of mine, because she was very multidisciplinary in the way that she looked at things. In 2009, she also became the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And she's kind of famous. Her most popular, or her most well-known book is Governing the Commons, the Evolution of Institutions for Collective Actions. And she talks about basically how you can have these different systems manage things. You don't necessarily need a corporate manager or a government manager, although sometimes you do. So she's not wedded to one idea. She's basically wedded to pragmatism. Well, what she also did was, in addition to her own work, she also edited a lot of manuscripts and kind of compendiums of others that were doing research, kind of in following her methods, and looking at ways that people used resources. And she kind of emphasized the CPR system, common pool resources. So I won't go into it in detail now, but if you're interested in this, there's plenty of good books about her or by her, and so on. Now, I won't go through all of this, but this is there in case you're interested. Kind of the 8 rules you need to successfully manage the commons. Like I said, I'm not going to go through these right now. They're not going to show up on the exam or anything. They're just there for those of you who want to sustainably manage the commons. They'll be on the PowerPoint in the modules. Now, like I said, Ostrom conducted decades of this research, of this multi-method empirical research, along with several colleagues, and really just, kind of disproved Hardin's tragedy of the commons theory, because what she found is that people wouldn't act how rational choice theory would assume them to act. Remember, rational choice theory, you're calculating cost benefit all the time and stuff, but we showed how that was wrong when, you've got all sorts of things like culture and hormones and all these different things that, play a role in your decision making. And, through all of these different methods that she used, she was basically able to show that people weren't, acting out of rational self-interest, or at least, rarely was that the case in terms of resource management. And she has this quote I like: "There's no reason to believe that bureaucrats and politicians, no matter how well-meaning, are better at solving problems than the people on the spot who have the strongest incentive to get the solution right." So, what does that mean in terms of the environment? I'll talk about that a little bit more. I might get my hair where it needs to be there. Okay. Actually, I'll return to this when I talk about the environment on Thursday, because it fits in well there. But back to kind of population growth rates in general. So we know that fertility rates can be brought down, and we also know that basically, as economies modernize and you get increased access to public health services and nutrition and so on, you see a fall in fertility rates. You have to remember that throughout most of human history, throughout most of the world, people had large families. Women had lots of kids. It was not uncommon for women to give birth 15 to 20 times, with half dying at some point, either during the birth or within the first few years or so. And that's why, for a long time, for most of human history, we've had these large families. Also, when in agricultural societies, families can help on the farm, that sort of thing. But as you start to urbanize, large families start to become an economic drag. You need more bedrooms, you need more this and that. So we see as people have moved into cities over the last century, we've seen population growth rates fall quite dramatically in those places. Just to talk about population growth in general, there's two measurable forms of growth that you can take. One's the arithmetic, and then geometric or exponential, which doubles over time. You've probably learned about this a lot from COVID over the last couple of years, but basically if you've got something operating by the principle of simple addition, say there's 7 units, going by the addition of 1, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. By the 7th digit you're at 7. If you're doing it exponentially and doubling over time, you start with 1, that doubles to 2, then 4, 8, and then by the time you're at that 7th digit, you're at the number 64, because it's growing exponentially. So there was this, legend that a king offered a reward to the inventor of chess, and he said, and the inventor said, "I don't need any money or gold. I just need 1 grain." I think it was rice, actually. 1 grain of rice or wheat on the first square, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, basically doubling it for each square on all 64 squares on the board. And the king, not really understanding exponential growth, said, sure, I'll just end up giving away a bunch of rice, no big loss to me, that sort of thing. Well, that ends up being 18.5 quintillion pieces of rice that he had to give away, and the kingdom went bankrupt, and the king was beheaded, and so on. But you see how it goes. You start out with 1, and by the end of the first row, everything's doubling. You're at 128. That doubles to 256. Then you're at 32,000, etc., until you get down to the bottom, and it's 18.5 quintillion. Here's what it would look like on a chart. You see throughout most, say this is time down here on the x-axis. Throughout most of this period, the arithmetic growth is, well above the geometric or exponential growth curve. But once you start doubling the numbers, and as they start getting larger, then it doesn't take long for the exponential growth curve to, rise way above the arithmetic growth curve. So we're actually seeing, a lot of exponential growth, and we have seen a lot of exponential growth in COVID at various times. And save the discussion on that till later when we read Apollo 0. Well, why am I talking about this stuff now? Well, because the human species has been growing at an exponential rate. I think one of the things that's pretty fascinating is that it takes all of human history to reach the first billion people in roughly 1800. I think this chart does a good job of showing it. So there you have 1 billion people. It takes about 120 years for the second billion to be added, almost 40 years for the third. And then after that, it's, an average of like every 12 years or so, we're adding a billion people. And so by 2028, estimated, to be roughly at 8 billion people. Again, this is all pre-COVID, so we don't know, we still just don't know what it's going to mean for long-term demographic trends, especially as societies are affected in different ways. A lot of unknowns ahead, a lot of work for statisticians to do. So one of the most important concepts from this lecture, and perhaps from this class, is the total fertility rate, the TFR. So this measures the average number of children average number of children born by a woman during her reproductive years. Average number of children burned. I don't know where that came from. Okay, so average number of children born. So basically, in the yellow, the United States, you have 2 to 2.9, because these are talking about averages here. So the places that have the smallest populations, 2 or less, Canada, all of Europe, Russia, China, Japan, so on. Then you've got 2 to 3 roughly kids per woman, and that's the United States and south into South America, certain parts of Asia. And then you get into the bigger families where it's 4 or 5 and more, and that's most of sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia as well. Now, this is 2000 to 2004. Not much has changed since then in terms of like the general trend of where continents are. But if we were to take this map and look at it 100 years ago in 1920, basically everywhere would be red. Everywhere would look like Africa. And as Europe industrialized and urbanized, and as the United States industrialized and urbanized, that's when you started to see the total fertility rate go down. And so that has basically been what's happening in South America and in Asia as well. There's greater access to birth control. There's, for all those reasons I went over moments ago. I did want to talk about this demographic transition, well, watch this video by Hans Rosling, the late Hans Rosling. He was a fantastic statistician and a great presenter, and he was kind of famous for using a lot of digital holograms to make these charts with bubbles that were countries and stuff. But I like this one because it's kind of an analog version where he uses IKEA boxes, but he does a good job of explaining these growth trends.
I still remember the day in school when our teacher told us that the world population had become 3 billion people. And that was in 1960. And I'm going to talk now of how world population has changed from that year and into the future. But I will not use digital technology as I've done during my first 5 TED Talks. Instead, I have progressed, and I am today launching a brand new analog teaching technology that I picked up from IKEA. This box contains 1 billion people. And our teacher told us that the industrialized world, 1960, had 1 billion people. And the developing world, she said, they had 2 billion people. And they lived away then. There was a big gap between the 1 billion in the industrialized world and the 2 billion in the developing world. The industrialized world, people were healthy, educated, rich, and they had small families. And their aspiration was to buy a car. And in 1960, all Swedes were saving to try to buy a Volvo like this. This was the economic level at which Sweden was. But in contrast to this, the developing world, far away, the aspiration of the average family there was to have food for the day. And they were saving to be able to buy a pair of shoes. There was an enormous gap in the world when I grew up. And this gap between the West and the rest has created a mindset of the world which we still use linguistically when we talk about the West and the developing world. But the world has changed, and it's overdue to upgrade that mindset and that taxonomy of the world and to understand it. And that's what I'm going to show you. Because since 1960, what has happened in the world up to 2010 is that a staggering 4 billion people have been added to the world population. Just look how many. The world population has doubled since I went to school. And of course there has been economic growth in the West. A lot of companies have happened to grow the economy, so the Western population moved over to here. And now their aspiration is not only to have a car, now they want to have a holiday on a very remote destination, and they want to fly. So this is where they are today. And the most successful of the developing countries here, they have moved on, you know, and they have become emerging economies, we call them. And they are now buying cars. And what happened a month ago was that the Chinese company Geely, they acquired the Volvo company. And then finally the Swedes understood that something big had happened in the world. You know? So there they are. And the tragedy is that the 2 billion over here that is struggling for food and shoes, they are still almost as poor as they were 50 years ago. The new thing is that we have the biggest pile of billions, the 3 billions here, which are also becoming emerging economies. Because they are quite healthy, relatively well educated, and they already also have 2 to 3 children per woman, as those have. And their aspiration now is, of course, to buy a bicycle. And then later on they would like to have a motorbike also. But this is the world we have today. No longer any gap. But the distance from the poorest here, the very poorest, to the very richest over here is wider than ever. But there is a continuous world from walking, biking, driving, flying. There are people on all levels, and most people tend to be somewhere in the middle. This is the new world we have today in 2010. And what will happen in the future? Well, I'm going to project into 2050. I was in Shanghai recently, and I listened to what's happening in China, and it's pretty sure that they will catch up, just as Japan did. All the projection, this one will grow with 1 to 2 or 3%, and this grows with 7, 8, and then they will land up here. They will start flying. And these lower middle income countries, the emerging economies, they will also forge forwards economically. And if, but only if, we invest in the right green technology so that we can avoid severe climate change and energy can still be relatively cheap, then they will move all the way up here. And they will start to buy electric cars. Isn't it? This is what we will find there. So what about the poorest 2 billion? What about the poorest 2 billion here? Will they move on? Well, here population comes in, because there we already have 2 to 3 children per woman. Family planning is widely used, and population growth is coming to an end. Here population is growing. So these 2 billions will in the next decades increase to 3 billions, and they will thereafter increase to 4 billions. There is nothing but the nuclear war of a kind we've never seen that can stop this from happening, because we already have this in process. But if, and only if, they get out of poverty, they get education, they get improved child survival, they can buy a bicycle and a cell phone and come here, then population growth will stop up there in 2050. We cannot have people on this level looking for food and shoes, because then we get continued population growth. And let me show you why, by converting back to the old-time digital technology. Here I have on the screen my country bubbles. Every bubble is a country, the size is population, the colors show the continent. The yellow one there is the Americas, dark blue is Africa, brown is Europe, green is Middle East, and this light blue is South Asia, that's India, and this is China. Size is population. Here I have children per woman. 2 children, 4 children, 6 children, 8 children. Big families, small families. The year is 1960, and down here child survival. The percentage of children surviving childhood up to starting school. 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, and almost 100%, as we have today in the wealthiest and healthiest countries. Look, this is the world my teacher talked about in 1960. 1 billion Western world here, high child survival, small families, and all the rest, the rainbow of the developing countries with very large families and poor child survival. What has happened? I start the world. Here we go. Can you see, as the year passed by, child survival is increasing. They get soap, hygiene, education, vaccination, penicillin, and then family planning. Family size is decreasing. They get up to 90% of child survival, then family is decreasing. Also the Arab countries in the Middle East is falling down there. Look, Bangladesh catching up with India. The whole emerging economy world joins the Western world with good child survival and small family size, but we still have the poorest billion. Can you see the poorest billion? Those boxes I had over here? They are still up here, and they still have a child survival of 70 to 80%, meaning that if you have 6 children born, there will be at least 4 who survive to the next generation, and the population will double in 1 generation. So the only way of really getting world population to stop is to continue to improve child survival to 90%. That's why investments by Gates Foundation, UNICEF and aid organizations, together with national government in the poorest countries, are so good. Because they are actually helping us to reach a sustainable population size of the world. We can stop at 9 billion if we do the right things. Child survival is the new green. It's only by child surviving that we will stop population growth. And will it happen? Well, I'm not an optimist. Neither am I a pessimist. I'm a very serious possibilist. It's a new category where we take emotion apart and we just work analytically with the world. It can be done. We can have a much more just world with green technology and with investments to alleviate poverty and global governance, the world can become like this. And look at the position of the Old West. Remember when this blue box was all alone, leading the world, living its own life? This will not happen. The role of the Old West in the New World is to become the foundation of the modern world. Nothing more, nothing less. But it's a very important role. Do it well and get used to it. Thank you very much.
All right, so that was Hans Rosling. He's got a number of great presentations. Highly recommend if you're interested in statistics, check out some of his stuff. As I said, he's good at presenting. In one presentation, he swallows a sword. So, yeah, he's got a flair for the dramatic. So what he's referring to is, and what I was talking about before then, is this demographic transition theory, where you have rural societies that start out with high fertility, lots of kids, but you have high mortality. Lots of those kids are going to die. Little food, bad health care, that sort of thing. But then you start to see a drop in mortality rates. Usually because of modernization, urbanization, you get better sanitation, healthcare, more nutritious foods, and more food is available. And then 3, you start to get fertility rates to start to decrease to a level that's about the same as the mortality rates, and the population then kind of stabilizes. And I should say that back in the 1970s, I believe Mexico's total fertility rate was like 5 or 7, 5 to 7 kids. And then you saw in the 1990s and early 2000s, and it was really the 1990s that you saw a huge influx of people coming from Mexico. And it was, people that were born during that period in the 1970s, where you still had women having 5 or 7 kids. Now, the total fertility rate in Mexico, I could look it up on my phone really quick, but I believe it's like 2.3 or something like this. In the United States, it's around 2.1. So the total fertility rate in Mexico is actually about the same as the United States. And I've been saying for the last few years that we're probably going to see less migration to the United States from Mexico itself, unless there's some, major devastating, earthquake, tornado, hurricane, whatever. And so you've noticed that a lot of the immigrants that have been trying to come to the United States in recent years have tried to cross the border have not actually been Mexican, but have been more likely to have been from Central America, passing through Mexico, or as we're seeing today, this week, Haiti and so on. So anyway, I just wanted to say that I would imagine we'll continue to see less immigration to the United States from Mexico, unless conditions get really bad in Mexico because of the change in the total fertility rate. This is kind of, what rich countries look like, the demographics. On the bottom here, you've got populations, males over here, blue, yellow for the females. Then you've got the age groups here. This is kind of what a typical rich country looks like. You've got, a smaller but growing, elderly population, but a lot of the population is kind of middle-aged, becoming elderly, that sort of thing. But you don't have as many kids. You notice that some of the smallest groups are children. Now compare that to the poorer countries, and you have this pyramid. Whoops. pyramid shape, where most of the population is actually younger. So, if you look at many places and countries in Africa or the Middle East and many parts of Asia, the average age is like, 15, 19 or something like that. Where's the action going to be? Where we know that the United States and other countries are going to be much older. So here you've got the Democratic Republic of the Congo, one of the most dangerous places on earth. I think at one time there were 14 countries that had military forces there back in the 90s. They have that kind of classic pyramid shape. You've got the United States, where you've got, this is the baby boomers here, though they're kind of moving up now. You have another kind of boom of the Gen Z, which would be your generation. Interestingly, you've got negative growth happening in Germany. What does negative growth mean? Basically, it's you can't meet the replacement rate. Replacement rate is a term used by demographers and labor economists and sociologists to refer to basically when one person retires, you have, someone else there to, take part in the workforce, essentially. Kind of conspiracy theorists that don't know what they're talking about have talked about the replacement rate, thinking that it means that you're trying to replace white people with, brown people or something. And that's not really what it refers to at all. It can be that only in the sense that, white families in Europe and the United States are having small numbers of children, usually 2. And that's not enough to, pay into Social Security and other welfare systems like in Europe. And so that's why you have immigration, and that's why, immigration, migrants can replace those workers that are retiring. But again, it has nothing to do with race or ethnicity or anything like that. Only to conspiracy theorists. Looking at Japan's, kind of standard population pyramid, or whatever you want to call it. This, too, I think is also fairly interesting. It's also interesting, I never used to be able to do this in my lectures in class, where I could, see how my hair looked. Okay, I think it's looking good. Okay. All right, so life expectancy. So along with total fertility rate, another reason that we have more people on the earth right now is they're living longer, considerably so. This is, you look at Europe, the America, Asia, Africa, the world, going from, 1760 to up into the early 1900s. Basically, the average lifespan was, around 40. I think, as I mentioned earlier, or was that in another lecture? Anyway, basically the average life expectancy was, below 40. It was actually 35 throughout most of human history. And so, people like me who are 40, we were seen as being elders, and, you elders had all this wisdom because, you lived to age 40. How did you do it? Please impart your wisdom onto us, that sort of thing. And then you get, the explosion of sanitation systems. I mean, I think that's one of the big reasons for, the increase in human health and well-being was the flushing toilet, as we'll talk about later when we talk about technology. But you see pretty, over the course of the 1880s to the 1980s, the average life expectancy goes from 35 in Europe and the United States, most elsewhere, into the 70s and into the 60s. For the United States life expectancy has gone down for the last 3 years, and that's primarily due to drug abuse, the opioid pandemic, whatever you want to call it. So that's, and suicide and a lot of things that have been hitting the kind of male white population. If you remember back to when we, the first lecture when we talked about suicide and so on. So anyway, that's another reason that the population is larger, is because people are living longer, and that raises some really tough questions as to how we're going to, care for the growing elderly population. Are you ready for retirement? Is anyone saving money for their retirement already? You're probably planning to save money to pay back your student loans. So this, I think, is a fascinating table comparing 2000, the average age, the median age, to the projected median age in 2050. Again, pre-COVID, but still gives you some idea of the general trends. So the country with the oldest median age in 2000 was Japan, with the median age of 41, which that's pretty old. Then Italy is 40, and you get a number of pretty much almost all European countries then have average ages in the late 30s, early 40s. The United States is down in the early to mid 30s. Again, that's because you have immigration coming in. America has more immigrants than any of these countries, and so immigrants tend to be younger. So that actually is one of the things that keeps America's median age lower than you see in a lot of the developed capitalist countries and communist countries as well. Now, if we project to 2050, Spain becomes potentially the country with the oldest population. Median age of 55, Italy 54, Japan 53, even China 51. I mean, right now, 1 out of 4 people in China is over the age of 65. So they've got a crisis of elderly care coming up too. But what I want to stress here, when we look at these numbers in 2050 of, projected numbers of where the average the average age of the society is the mid-50s. There has never, ever been a society in the history of the world where you have had the average age be in the 50s. So that is going to transform our societies in ways that we probably can't even imagine right now. But for years I've been telling students, if you want to make money or to have job security, do something, something with the elderly and developing elderly care and healthcare and something like that. Because as I said, we're seeing a very old, rich world. Now, that'll be interesting too, because, you're going to have this elderly populations in the US and Europe and Japan, and then you have these in China, and then you've got these young populations in Africa and parts of South America and so on. So, it's going to be very interesting how things play out in the coming years. So I'm sure you've heard of the word baby boomers. Sometimes not everyone has. Baby boomers are basically this group that was born between 1946 and 1964. During the Second World War, all the men went off to fight the Japanese or to fight the Germans or Italians, and then they came back and, they got busy with their wives and whatnot, and you had this boom of babies, and it happened in a lot of European countries as well, Japan as well, and other places. And so I do want to point out, though, that this is a big difference, 1946 to 1964. So when a baby boomer born in 1946 turned 20, it was mid-60s. You've got the civil rights going on, the war in Vietnam, etc., etc. However, with the baby boomer that's born in 1964, when they turn 20, they're, in the middle of the 1980s, and there's new wave music and MTV and, all this stuff, all these changes. So, sometimes we treat this group as if it's a big monolith, and it's just numerically it's it's very diverse, but a lot of the attitudes in social surveys generally show kind of a similar worldview among people that were born during this period. We've had a few baby boomer presidents, most recently Donald Trump, and I think I actually need to put Biden's picture up here because I think Biden would be 78. Yeah, Biden would be a boomer as well. So I've got to update the slide. George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton. She came very close. And I love this picture because in 1992, when Bill Clinton first ran for office, he was asked if he had ever smoked marijuana, and he famously said, "Yes, I have, but I did not inhale." And you kind of have to inhale in order for the effects to work. Oh, and marijuana is a plant that people can smoke to get high, as some of you probably know better than some of others. So anyway, everyone kind of thought that was, kind of funny that he said that. But if you look at Hillary right here and look at her eyes, she looks like she may have inhaled right before this picture was taken. It's always kind of waiting for that to come out of, during the 2016 election, another Clinton scandal, Okay, so how many of you are going to college to make money to help your parents during their retirement? Probably not something that's, many of you have thought of or considered, but I think it's something that increasingly a lot of people are starting to think about as we start to realize that we may not have the resources we really need for addressing the population crises that we're facing. Now, just to kind of show, I think, where we see some of the potential crises. This is percentage of population 65 and older with 2 or more chronic conditions. And, what I think is, rather alarming about this is, if you think right now, just in terms of, this was 2018, so before COVID, the states that are being hit really hard right now are a lot of these states where you have a lot of people with a lot of elderly people with 2 or more chronic conditions, which means that they're probably more susceptible to coronavirus and having a more severe experience severe experience with coronavirus. So you see a lot of counties, and most of these are rural counties, where you've got the elderly with a lot of health conditions. So, as I said, that's why a lot of these places are getting hit really hard with COVID, because you also have a lot of people in these places that are getting misinformation and are not vaccinating, and we're seeing the results. And you can almost predict where it's going to be based upon where the most coronavirus cases are happening from this map in 2018, just based on where the elderly with chronic conditions live. And it's, like I said, you can look at this and then look at a map of where COVID's at right now, and they seem to overlap pretty interestingly. So what does that mean? We talk about baby boomers and, generation, I guess we didn't talk about Generation X, which I guess came afterward, born in the 70s. And then the millennials. I'm sort of an elder millennial, kind of like the last year you could be considered a millennial. So they've already jumped to Gen Z for you guys, which I don't know why we had to go to the end of the alphabet. I hope you're not the last generation in America. Z2 or something. I'm not sure what the next generation will be called. But maybe sociologically, it could be called the sandwich generation. I should say that many of us are entering the sandwich generation. When I started teaching, I was in my early 20s. But when I started teaching more about demography and so on, it was probably, late 20s, early 30s. Now I'm entering my 4th decade of life, and yeah, I'm starting to understand what they mean by the sandwich generation. So the sandwich generation is basically referring to people who have to take care of their elderly parents as well as their own children, and they're kind of stuck in the sandwich. So that would be, the people in their 30s and 40s and 50s. And I should say that it happens on the private level in terms of, people paying for their own parents and kids, but it also happened on a more social level in terms of paying for Social Security, paying taxes for schools and daycare centers, that sort of thing. So no matter what, you're going to be in that sandwich, paying for the older and the younger generations. And we're going to be doing this, though. See this guy eating the sandwich, the people in the sandwich there. I think what's important to understand, though, is that we're going to have to try to figure out this kind of conundrum in the midst of rapid environmental deterioration. And so I think this is a good stopping point for today's lecture. On Thursday, we'll talk about urbanization and the environment. All right, everyone, have a good week.